Good morning. Welcome again to the Pastor Study. We are continuing in the book of Genesis using the Wesleyan Publishing House material as our student guide. Today we continue looking at the relationships told in stories. We notice that we have focused on one family, in particular, the family of Abraham. And today we're going to highlight again that God is the creator. And he can dictate how he is to be worshiped, and he can order us to follow his commands, which makes it challenging sometimes for us to best understand what he's asking of us and how to follow through on those mandates. As we notice here in our chart, we are going to begin to transition from Abraham to Isaac today. Our first story is primarily focused on Abraham. But I also want to add a layer of understanding that Isaac is viewing, observing, and learning about his God through what Abraham is doing. So we have Abraham, just to give us a quick family tree. I know when I was first starting to learn about Abraham's sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, I often got a couple principal characters confused, and I just find a family tree like this to be very helpful. So Abraham had two sons. We only track one son because he was the son of promise, Isaac. Isaac has Esau and Jacob. Esau was the firstborn. And then Jacob ends up having 12 sons. They become the 12 patriarchs of Israel. And sometimes understanding Bible stories is a challenge because we don't understand the cultural setting. I think of this term patriarch, and I didn't grow up with a patriarch of our family, someone, a male in particular, who has total authority, total control, king of his castle kind of thing, where when he passed judgment, when he made a decision, it was final, and there was no arguing it, there was no negotiating it, where family is not a democracy, but really a dictatorship in a sense. In the Bible, though, when we talk about patriarch, we're talking more of a spiritual leader, not just someone who's making the day-to-day decisions. It is understood that he has a closer walk with God, and in fact, he has a responsibility to have a closer walk with God so that he could care for his people. So what we're going to look at today is God called Abraham. God's also going to have an encounter with Isaac. We'll see that today in our study. And then also later, probably starting next week or the week after, we'll see that he has a personal encounter with Jacob. So each of these men as patriarchs are also the spiritual priests of their family as well. Okay, so entering into Genesis chapter 2, Isaac is about 25 years old. Josephus picks that age. Most scholars will say he's more of a young man than a young boy in age, although we don't know exactly how old he was. God chooses to test Abraham and says to him, Abraham responds, "Here I am. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you." So the challenge is really to grapple with, what is Abraham thinking? How is he processing this request? This is the son of promise. You were very specific, Lord, about saying the one born of Sarah will be my heir. Well, how can he be the heir if I'm going to kill him on Mount Moriah? So the whole question comes into play. Why did God test Abraham's faith and obedience in this manner? So I'm just going to pause here a minute for you, if you're studying this on your own or your group, to consider some possibilities of why God tested Abraham's faith in this way. For my part, I think there's two layers to this. The first one is, we have to understand the culture of this time. There's a lot of gods requiring loyalty from their subjects by them sacrificing their firstborn. If you sacrifice your firstborn son, then you truly are devoted to this God. So that's the general culture. So as bizarre as this request sounds to us, it was actually a cultural norm of the pagan gods of this time. And we'll see this, Molech and Chemosh, where God says, don't do it like they do. So it really makes it a challenge to try to understand if God's going to later condemn this under the laws of Moses, why is he saying this is a test of devotion here in the life of Abraham? Well, I think there's a second layer to all this. Isaac is 25 years old. And I'm just wondering if there's a possibility that as Isaac grows up and he sees all these pagans devoted to their God to the point where they're willing to kill a family member, is he going to call into question his own father's devotion and willingness to do whatever God asks? So I think there was a testing of Abraham's faith, and there was also a lesson to this 25-year-old Isaac of how devoted his father was to the true and living God. Well, it is important to listen to God. And I'll add the second one here as well. It is also essential to obey God. The challenge is when you get this kind of request from your God that you were to murder a family member, you better be pretty darn sure you're actually hearing from God. I watch this show off and on. I'm not a devoted follower by any means, but I find it interesting and distracting to listen to a program called Ancient Aliens. And they actually covered this situation when talking about evil entities interfering in human history to knock things off track. And they actually postulated in part of the program that an evil entity had really been the voice that Abraham had heard, because this evil entity wanted Abraham to wipe out his own family line. The text in the Bible, particularly as we read in Genesis chapter 22, really doesn't allow for that interpretation. The text as it was recorded by Moses stated clearly that it was God speaking to Abraham, and Abraham understood it to be God. And we'll follow that up with Hebrews chapter 11 as another affirmation. So Abraham had heard God's voice enough that he knew that he wasn't making a mistake here. However, for us today, we need to understand that not all thoughts are facts. Not all supernatural sensations we have that we could attribute to being God's voice are necessarily God's voice. We need to be super careful and discerning what is of God. And I get affirmation of this from strangest places. Occasionally, my wife and I watch murder shows. And there was this one man, and they finally tracked him down. He was a serial killer. The police tracked him down. And it all tracked out to being this man had heard voices, and he went to his man of God in the church, and he said, this priest said to him, well, that's God. Do what he tells you to do. And this voice was telling him to murder people. So just because you're hearing a voice and you know it's not coming out of your own head doesn't necessarily mean it's God. Why is it important to know how and when to obey God? Well, that's where we tie back to our original premise. God is the creator. He created us in a context called the earth, in this biosphere, for us to grow in relationship with him. And the test of that growth in that relationship is how quickly do we discern what he's saying, how eager are we to do it, and with what accuracy or righteousness do we carry out what he's asked us to do. I was watching a nature documentary. I do that to distract myself from time to time, particularly when I'm wanting to wind down and take an afternoon nap. And I caught this episode talking about drongo birds. The meerkats, I love the meerkats, how they stand on their hind legs, and they're always on the alert for the predator. Well, this meerkat had just caught his scorpion, was ready to dine down on this scorpion and eat him. And he hears this bird call. It's a predator from the skies. And he immediately drops his lunch and flees. Better to lose your lunch than to lose your life. Well, here it ends up being this drongo bird who had learned how to imitate these birds of prey. And so as soon as the meerkat ran off, the drongo bird swoops down and he claims the meal for himself. He's an imitator. He's not the real voice of the predator, but he has figured out a scheme to get what he wants. And so this is all about, again, discerning God's voice and knowing it for who it really is. Is it just some deception, or is it really God? So we get back to Genesis 22. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Now, there's an important thing happening in context here. We have 125-year-old Abraham. Remember, he was 100 when Isaac was born. We're suggesting Isaac is 25 years old. So we have a 125-year-old man binding up his 25-year-old son, pulls out his knife, and he's about to kill him. And we have to wonder, why isn't Isaac resisting? Is this patriarch concept so strong, or maybe his trust in his father is so great that he just offers no resistance at all? We are told that nobody has gone with them. If you look back in Genesis 22, Abraham had taken the wood and the burnt offering and laid it on his son, took in his hand the fire and the knife. They both went up together without anybody else. And Isaac had said, "My father, here I am. Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And so they both went on together. So he's aware of what's going on. He's questioning what's the outcome of all this. So what do you think Isaac must have felt when his father bound his hands and feet to put him on the altar? Wonderment, surprise, shock. I mean, there's all kinds of feelings that are going through his mind. He knows what a sacrifice is. He's seen his father sacrifice animals on an altar. He knows what an altar is. He knows the outcome is you kill something and you burn it. The Lord comes swooping in with this angel of the Lord and says, "Stop. Don't stretch out your hand against the lad. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." So this goes back to the initial verses we noticed at the very forefront of the chapter, that this is all a test to find out what Abraham's true devotion to the Lord is. So we're challenged in the material to describe how Abraham must have felt when the angel of the Lord interrupted his sacrifice of Isaac. I think another interesting detail is that there was a ram provided for the sacrifice that Abraham did not bring up on the mountain. So the Lord still required a sacrifice, but he did not want it to be the son of promise. So I think there's some confusion here in Abraham's mind as to what this was all about. I don't think he totally understood how he was being tested, but he knew what God asked of him to do, and he did it. Hebrews chapter 11 does provide us with this insight. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises, Abraham, was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac your offspring will be named." So Abraham considered that God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So this writer of the Hebrews is suggesting, or actually I guess we would say telling us as God's commentary, that Abraham thought he was going to have to carry through on the act, but God would bring his son back from the dead. I hadn't seen this question before in any of my studies or even sermons I've heard on the sacrifice of Isaac. What do you think Sarah's reaction was? Again, this is a patriarchal society. If a father wants to kill a son, then he can't. He's the head of his clan. But it's interesting. What did she think of all this? It doesn't tell us at all in the scriptures what happened when Isaac and Abraham came home. Well, Isaac grows up, so we're about 15 years later. We are told specifically that Isaac finds his wife at the age of 40. But here's the deal. The Canaanites surrounding Abraham in this land of promise are totally pagan. They are polytheistic. They have these bizarre practices, one of which is sacrificing your firstborn. And God says, you can't intermarry with people in this region. So Abraham says, well, the only place I still have family is back over the river. So he asked his servant, the oldest of his household, to go on a quest back to Abraham's country and kindred and find a wife for Isaac. Now, this is a beautiful story. One of my favorites here in the life of Abraham is really Eliezer. I'm going to call the servant Eliezer. We don't know for sure. This entire chapter here, chapter 24, doesn't tell us his name, but there is an interesting note back in Genesis 15, verse 2, where Abraham says, before Isaac is born, I'm going to have to give my entire inheritance over to Eliezer because I have no children. So it is possible that this man who was going to receive the entire inheritance is now 35-ish years later going to find a wife for the new heir, Isaac. And we see no reluctance on his part other than, what happens if it doesn't work out? I can't find this wife. And Abraham assures him that this is going to work. So Eliezer shows up at this oasis, and he's in the process of talking to God. And he says to the Lord, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water where the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. And before he was even finished speaking, Rebekah comes out with a jar of water on her shoulder, and she does exactly what Eliezer asked for as a confirmation. Now, this was really a wise condition that Eliezer put on this prayer request, because this woman not only cared about others, but she went the extra mile to care for another person's camels as well. So an interesting character trait that Eliezer was looking for. And coincidence? She just happened to be of the right family line to be eligible to marry into Abraham's family. Of course, it's not coincidence. God had all arranged this ahead of time. This was really an arranged marriage. Isaac is not going to have any say in this. So we see here that Isaac, from a distance, sees Rebekah, and he immediately accepts her as the wife. And what's interesting is Rebekah is barren. So Isaac has heard the stories, of course, of Abraham and Sarah, his mother, not being able to have a child, and how it took 2.5 decades for him to come on the scene. So he instantly prays to the Lord, and the Lord answered, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Because this is such a culture focused on the patriarchs, we don't often hear about the spiritual walk of the women in this culture. But here, the author pauses to say that Rebekah is wondering why these children are so active in her womb. So she asks of the Lord, and the Lord responds to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. And one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Now that totally contradicts culture of the time. The firstborn son automatically gets the inheritance, and the younger has to serve the older. And yet God is telling Rebekah, even before she gives birth to this children, that order will be reversed, and the younger child will become the predominant of the 2 children. We talked about Abraham having a walk with the Lord, and I had mentioned in a previous video that God has no grandchildren. So Isaac is now going to have to decide what he's going to do with his father's God. And the Lord does appear to Isaac and has a conversation and gives him specific instruction and says, I will bless you, and we'll notice in a couple other slides here, because of your father Abraham. And as I promised Abraham that his descendants will get this land, your descendants will get these lands as well. And here's where the emphasis is on, because I swore to your father, I'm going to do these things, because you are his son. Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. 10-fold was a profitable harvest. 100-fold, obviously, 10 times as great as what would be a profitable yield from the field. So he became a very rich man. And just like we had talked about prosperity before between Lot and Abraham, Isaac's prosperity is going to cause some issues for him as well. When you get more sheep, more camel, more donkeys, you're going to need more land, and there's people living in the land. God has said this is the promised land, but there's still people there, and there's going to be arguments and contention over what well belongs to whom. And Isaac develops early on a philosophy of, if there's contention, I'm going to move on to where there's no contention, until finally he lands in Rehoboth. Rehoboth, if you're on the eastern seaboard of the United States, you recognize that as a common name of some major seaside cities. Okay, so Isaac has another appearance of the Lord at Beersheba, and God reaffirms again, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. This is being passed down the family line because Abraham chose God and rejected the pagans in his home city of Ur and did the trek and landed where God told him to land and stopped where he was told to stop. A blessing is going to be passed on to his children because of that. And Isaac recognizes that, and he builds an altar in the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there, and Isaac's servants dug a well. He discerned that that was where God wanted him to settle down. Okay, so we're going to just fast forward a little bit here to say that these 2 children are born, but Abraham is going to prefer Esau, and Rebekah is going to prefer Jacob. Now that's very important to note because of how the next story plays out as we get into it next week. And by way of a teaser, we're going to look at Jacob and Esau in the very expensive bowl of soup. So come back next week and we'll flesh out the cultural details of that story and how it impacted both Jacob and Esau as they went into their future and raised their own families.